Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast from BBC History Magazine, Britain's best-selling history magazine. I'm Ellie Cawthorne. On today's podcast, you'll hear a conversation with the biographer and literary agent Andrew Loney. Andrew's most recent book, The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves, tells the story of Dicky and Edwina Mountbatten, one of the most remarkable power couples in 20th century Britain. Our deputy digital editor, Eleanor Evans, met Andrew in London to find out more.
Could we perhaps start by introducing the two figures who are central to your book?
Yes, Dicky Mountbatten was the son of Prince Louis of Battenberg, who became First Sea Lord. Dicky was the last godson of Queen Victoria. His mother was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, so he very much grew up within royal circles. His wife Edwina was the granddaughter of a very rich banker called Sir Ernest Cassel, and she came from, again, a very interesting background. Her ancestors included Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, and the philanthropist, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury.
So there have been books that have looked at both of their lives separately in the past, but your book looks at their lives intertwined. Why do you think it's so important to regard their lives in this way?
Well, I think that was my eureka moment, because, as you say, there had been books, but funnily enough, not for about 20 or 30 years. And no one had really looked at the papers. There are about 4,000 files at the University of Southampton, which no one really has gone through. Wonderful letters from him to his mother and father. A little less from her, but they just kept everything. But I think by looking at it through the portrait of the marriage, and it was a very unusual marriage because though it was very loving and supportive, they both had numerous affairs. But I think it was also a public partnership. So several times at the point where they were going to get divorced, she stuck with him because she wanted to support him in his roles, particularly when he went as Viceroy. So I think someone described it as a very English marriage. I don't know many English marriages where there are 18 lovers in them, but I think it gave a completely different perspective. And in fact, my next book's on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. But I think it created a different dynamic. And I think by being, I suppose, an intimate story of domestic story as much as the public story, it sort of humanized them.
Mm-hmm. In your book, it's clear that the Second World War is a turning point for both of them. So I wonder if we could talk first of all about their lives and the marriage before the war and what they were like as people.
Yes, they met when they were very young, in their early 20s, and married in a big ceremony, bigger than sort of any royal wedding now. 8,000 people were in the crowds around Parliament Square. They married at St Margaret's, which is in the shadow of Westminster Abbey. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, was the best man. King George V was there. So it was a pretty glittering occasion. Mountbatten was a naval officer, a very ambitious one, and most of that period up to the Second World War, he was just pursuing a naval career, both in London and in Malta and Portsmouth. She really was a rather sort of restless soul and really didn't have enough to do. And so she quite quickly embarked on a series of affairs with people in the polo playing set, which upset him greatly until he just accepted that was what was going to happen. She should just be discreet. And he himself took on several lovers, including a mistress called Yola Letellier, who remained his mistress till his death in 1979. So that was the sort of conventional portrait. She's not a particularly attractive character in this period. And in some ways you feel very sorry for him because of what he's having to go through. And then, of course, everything changes with the Second World War, and she finds her sense of purpose. And he is suddenly, through his mentor of Churchill, given all sorts of pretty big jobs. And everything changes. And she discovers voluntary work, and I think it's the making of her.
Looking a bit at Mountbatten's naval career in the war then, you talk about the Kelly destroyer episode. Some criticism has been levelled at him for this episode. Can we talk about that?
Yes, the HMS Kelly, he was the first and the last captain because basically it sunk under him. It was a new destroyer, very latest technology, much of which he'd incorporated himself. He's very interested in naval design. But he was a terrible commander. He drove the ships far too fast. He betrayed his presence when he didn't need to by just with his signalling. He didn't always obey orders. So there were a whole series of disasters from really September 1939 right through until May 1941, when the boat is sunk in the battle for Crete. But, he goes over mines and they're destroyed. He has torpedo attacks, which he could have avoided. Many people are killed in these episodes. And the irony is that he becomes a bit of a hero because he limps back after one of these episodes, he becomes this great hero, or the press make him this great hero. He's good looking, he's connected with the royals, and he's kind of forgiven. He's given the DSO. And what really shapes things is when his friend Noel Coward writes In Which We Serve, the film, which is a propaganda film about the Navy, which is based on Kelly. And I think that really turns his fortunes. But I think one of the reasons that Churchill's given all these, or gives him all these staff jobs, is he's determined he should never go back to sea again. He's just too dangerous.
Can we talk a little more about his character during this time as well? Because it seems that he's already very conscious of how he's being perceived. He's kind of not afraid to pull on his royal connections. What kind of man was he, and how was he perceived at this time?
Well, he was very ruthless, and in terms of his ambition. He was absolutely devastated when his father had to resign as First Sea Lord because of anti-German feeling during the First World War. The person who accepted the resignation was Churchill, and I think Churchill always felt guilty for not supporting him, and was one of the reasons why I think he took him as a wing later on. But Mountbatten, I think, was determined to get to the top. He didn't mind pushing people aside. He made a great play of his royal connections. It was a great joke the way he dropped them. And also because he had so much money, she was the richest heiress in the world when they married. He was able to entertain very extravagantly. He was as a young naval officer, would have the First Sea Lord to dinner, which is not something that normally happens. He was well connected. He knew the politicians. He was very against appeasement. And so he worked with people like Eden during the 1930s. So he had terrific opportunities. People were very jealous of him, but he worked hard. He played hard too. But he was one of those people who just got things right. So when he learnt to play polo, he would practice for hours each day to make sure that he really mastered it. And that was true again of his naval career. He worked very late. He deserved his success. Because of this German background, he didn't always play, shall we say, as a gentleman. So, for example, when he was responsible for one ship during the interwar period, he basically was determined to win all the prizes for sporting achievement, and that wasn't sort of seen as rather, he should have just been a little bit more, left a few things for other people. He would train very secretly so people didn't know. He didn't always play, shall we say, by the rules. Later on, people would say that if he could come through the door, he would still come through the chimney.
You mentioned there Dicky's preference for structure, for the minutiae, getting the details and scheduling right. If we look at Edwina, she was very much a different kind of character, and you write about their honeymoon, how Dicky had plotted out each night where they would stay, and Edwina hated the lack of spontaneity. How do we see that kind of difference in characters playing out in their marriage?
Well, I think they both just came to terms with it. One of the things that happened at the honeymoon is actually they went to tour one day and there were no beds there. And so she began to accept that perhaps planning was a good idea. But she'd led a pretty regulated childhood. Her mother died when she was 9. She was brought up by this elderly grandfather. And she really wanted to run free. And that's sort of what she did with these lovers. But she was a free spirit. In some ways, she was a woman ahead of her time. And you have to admire the way that she travelled. She abandoned her family, but she would travel all sorts of places. She was the first woman to go down the Burma-China Road, 800 miles, that no other woman had done at that time. And she would live very simply in tents in the desert. And she was a pretty extraordinary woman who wasn't going to be hidebound by convention and do exactly what she wanted. So she is, though one can't condone her behaviour to her family, there is a spirit of venture there which is quite appealing. But she was a very different kettle of fish, absolutely, to him. The irony is that eventually they did sort of come together, and I think it's symbolised by gates on their property, which had her crest on one side and his on the other. So the same gates, but just facing slightly different ways.
You've mentioned that Edwina obviously had a long line of lovers. Could we just look at maybe a couple of the men who popped up in Edwina's life?
Yeah, well, her daughter has identified 18. I can only find 16. So, but they started with a man called the best-looking man in British society called Hugh Molyneux, who was the heir to the Earl of Sefton, who was a British Army officer who then went out to be ADC in India to the Viceroy. That was followed by an American polo player called Laddie Sanford, who she probably had mothered a child with, which was aborted. She then moved on to a man called Mike Wardle, who worked for Beaverbrook on the Express, again a very dashing ex-army officer. A lot of them were in the hunting sort of polo set, socialites, but often quite intelligent people. There was a Hungarian count. There was a colleague of Mountbattens in the Navy whose wife sued for divorce in the High Courts. There were several black musicians, a man called Leslie Hutchinson, and the actor Paul Robeson. During the war, she had an affair with Bill Paley, who'd set up CBS. She then, at the end of the war, had an affair with Malcolm Sargent, the composer. So they're all quite varied characters and highly intelligent, interesting characters. So, but those are the ones I've come across. There are plenty more. I mean, her daughter used to joke that sometimes four of them would turn up, and she would come home, and the butler would say, "Mr. Molyneux is in the drawing room. So and so is in the library. So and so is in the study, and so is in the kitchen." And she would sort of move among them. So she was quite a character.
And Dicky obviously had his fair share of affairs as well. And from the letters that are available between the two of them, what kind of understanding came to exist between them? How did they deal with these infidelities?
Well, I think what really worried Dicky, he wasn't a jealous type, and because he since had his own career, he accepted that he perhaps hadn't given his wife as much attention as she deserved. They came to an arrangement. She wouldn't embarrass him. She would be discreet. There wouldn't be these high court actions for divorce, and there were several of those. He was very worried about upsetting the royal family, and that was in some ways why, when she had the affair with Hutchinson, she felt she had to go to court and sue the paper for libel. She actually won, but it was a bit of a stitch-up. I think a deal was done. But as long as, since the horses weren't scared, then that was fine. And he was quite discreet. She was herself very jealous. So poor old Dicky would come off on his naval leave, hoping to go off with Yola, to find that Edwina had whisked her off somewhere herself. So that was the way she dealt with it. It was not equal in that respect. But the children even accepted it, and she had a long-term affair with a man called Bunny Phillips, who the children just treated. They had two daughters, treated as another father. I think one of the fascinating things is that when Mountbatten had an affair during the Second World War with someone called Janie Lindsay, Janie Lindsay was also at that time having an affair with Bunny Phillips, who was having an affair with Edwina. So it was quite a complicated bit. Very Victorian and aristocratic approach, I think. As long as you have your heir and the servants aren't too worried, you can do what you want.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does all seem rather incestuous with the names that keep popping up. If we go back to the war then, we already talked about how the war helped Mountbatten's career to rise. But if we look at Edwina, she underwent some significant changes in terms of throwing herself into humanitarian work. What can you say about that?
Yes, she got involved with St. John Ambulance and the Red Cross, and she rose very, very quickly to basically becoming the most senior woman in the St. John Ambulance. She was highly intelligent. She was very charming. She was actually, funnily enough, well organised by then. She worked very hard. She'd learned a lot from her husband. She was very competitive with her husband, and I think wanted to earn his respect, particularly after her behaviour as just this sort of rootless socialite. And she did. She did wonderful. She was extremely brave like him. She would go through the Blitz, visiting the air raid wardens and various other things. She was very determined with politicians and used her connections to make sure that, for example, material and supplies were given to the right people. She travelled all over the world. She did a fundraising tour of the States with him in 1941. And she just worked herself to the bone. She suddenly found a purpose and validation. So she, and that continued right to the end of her life. She continued doing this work. She'd always, I think, because of this rather unhappy childhood, she had a horrible stepmother. She was sent away to school. The governess that she liked was removed by this horrible stepmother. She, I think, had a great sympathy for the sort of underdog and for children. Ironically, not good with her own children, but very good with other people's children. It was really the making of her. And he, of course, then was given these positions by Churchill. So he was made Chief in Combined Operations, which were preparing for D-Day, but also mounting a lot of these raids against occupied Europe. Some of the raids like Dieppe and things like the Cockleshell Heroes were his responsibility. And he was very good at that. He again thought outside the box. He brought in scientists to test soil samples and prepare things. They both had very strong leadership qualities. People followed them, they liked them, and they could command their support. So they both really took off. And then, having been made Chief of Combined Operations in 1941, in 1943 he was made Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia. That was a little bit of a deal done. The Americans got Europe, and the British were given Asia. And so he went off there. And I think one of the reasons that he was sent there was, to be honest, it was more a diplomatic post, a political post than a military one. But he, again, could get things done. So he was responsible for the 14th Army, the Forgotten Army. And he went out, there's a famous phrase, he went out and said to them, "You think you're forgotten. You're not forgotten. No one even knows about you, but you won't be forgotten. I will make sure that people, deal with this." And he tried to get a cabinet office position focused on Asia. He improved morale by shipping out, creating magazines and radio stations and sending out supplies and giving them more leave. He dealt with the problem of the fact that there weren't often enough troops because of malaria by making sure there were enough nurses and doctors there to deal with the malaria. And also, I think, interestingly, he fought through the monsoons, which no one thought was possible. And I think those 3 M's really did contribute to great success. He also was very good at letting people like Slim just get on with the job. He would bring in resources if necessary. If they needed aircraft or troops or whatever, he would get them. But he left the generals to do their own job.
Mm-hmm. So if he comes out of the war with these achievements of morale and these titles gained, these positions gained, what role does Edwina have then in his post-war positions? How does she go about helping him there?
The end of the war is very difficult for Edwina. In 1944, Bunny Phillips marries a woman called Gina Werner. Again, it's very incestuous. She, in fact, has introduced Gina to Bunny. Gina is the daughter of one of Mountbatten's colleagues at Combined Operations, Sir Harold Werner, and Gina is the niece of Edwina's sister-in-law and brother-in-law. So, I mean, they're all working the same sort of thing. And I mean, she's almost put on suicide watch. She takes years to recover from this, even though she's still having an affair with Malcolm Sargent at the time. But and she goes back to supporting her husband. He amazingly goes back to his naval career. He drops several ranks, having been basically, the most important person in Southeast Asia. He goes back to being quite a junior officer in the Mediterranean, and she's just a naval wife. And that's when they get to know the Queen and Prince Philip, who are posted to Malta in the post-war period. Mountbatten has been very instrumental, actually, also in bringing the royal couple together. Philip is his nephew. Philip's mother, Princess Alice, was the sister of his mother. And there's a very interesting correspondence in the Royal Archives between George VI and Mountbatten, basically plotting this courtship. So it's Mountbatten who ensures that Philip is the escort when they visit Dartmouth in 1939 when she's 13. There's lots of bringing them together. There's planning to put Philip into the Navy and then to nationalise him. He takes on the name of Mountbatten. So Mountbatten in some ways creates the modern House of Windsor, or Mountbatten Windsor. He's at the Stag Night for Philip, and they remain very close. And he becomes a great mentor to the Queen as well. She's known him ever since she was a child. Her mother couldn't stand Mountbatten because she felt he was a bit of a he switched allegiances very, very quickly after the Duke of Windsor, who he had been very friendly with, had to abdicate. And she rather blamed him for, in a sense, forcing her father to become king. So he's very, very close to royal circles. She's very depressed at this period. They actually think about getting divorced. And the only thing that really saves them is the invitation at the end of 1946 to go out and become the last viceroy. He's actually offered the job before Wavell is told that he's been sacked.
What can you say about his approach initially in India?
Well, Mountbatten is reluctant to go to India. He's worried. He's determined to become First Sea Lord. He thinks this is going to slow down his naval career. He also sees it's a pretty impossible, it's a poison chalice, he describes it, to go out there. You can't really win. But he has a very strong sense of duty. He feels that perhaps he can do something. He feels very loyal to King George VI, who sort of insists he should go out. And he goes out really just as on a fact-finding thing to find out what the situation is. The plan from the Labour government has said, we will give you your independence. We've talked about it long enough, and you're going to have it probably sometime in the summer of 1948. But when Mountbatten gets out there talking to everyone, and he's been criticised for this, but I think he had no choice. He sees that there's huge problems with communal violence. There's the whole thing. The British authority is dying. They haven't got the resources to either in terms of manpower, but also authority to do anything. And he realises that the only solution is to bring forward independence. It's an extraordinary thing. He goes out in March and he says, actually, in August, we're going to leave. And he did have this. He was very impatient. He did have the sense of basically making impossible tasks and then making sure everyone rounded and followed on. But, to divide, and also, of course, the nation had to be divided. The only solution then was not going to be any sort of federal solution, but to have this moth-eaten Pakistan that Jinnah wanted, and to then leave the rest of India Hindu. And they have to divide everything down to the military bands and who gets the last trombone. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Share their financial resources, break up the railways and all the infrastructure. And he's also got to deal with this complication of the Indian princes who have allegiance only to the king and are actually not part of the equation. And he basically bamboozles them, the Indian princes, into siding with going with India, with one or two exceptions who go into Pakistan. And of course, we have some of the ramifications of those problems still now with Hyderabad and Kashmir and elsewhere. But I mean, he does a pretty effective job. He gets Nehru very much on side. I think Nehru is a wily old fox and realises that if he gets Mountbatten to one side, he'll be fine. Jinnah plays a much straighter bat and slightly gets eased out of the whole thing. There isn't the same personal rapport. There's certainly a very strong rapport between Edwina and Nehru. I mean, there's some suggestion even that their affair began much earlier than people have suggested. The conventional view is their affair, whether it's physical or not, and I think it was physical, began just before the Mountbattens returned in the summer of 1948. But I think there's some evidence that it began even in the summer of 1947.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's absolutely a fascinating relationship that's in your book. Perhaps we could go on to that in a little while. But I wondered if you could say something on the criticisms that have been levelled at Mountbatten in terms of his naivety or perhaps ignorance of the violence that was predicted by bringing it forward.
I mean, the debate goes on, and I mean, it's difficult. I present different points of view, and I try and show. I mean, it is complex, and you can't. It's not black and white. I think he certainly wasn't impartial. I think he did side with the Hindus more than with the Muslims. The man who came to do the boundary partition, Cyril Radcliffe, was not experienced. He wasn't given enough time. He wasn't given, frankly, very good maps and information, and it was a very complicated thing to do. I think where Mountbatten, you would say maybe cynically, he decided not to announce the boundaries until after independence, so that the independence celebrations were not marred by the problems. The result of that was that, of course, the British were no longer in charge. The Indian politicians said, actually, we don't want British troops policing our borders. We'll deal with it. So I would blame the Indian politicians there. They could have worked together. So the result was that suddenly they announced these borders. Everyone panicked in those few months after partition. The troops were there. There were plenty of British troops who could have dealt with the situation. They didn't have the intelligence. The intelligence services had sort of gone across the Indians, but they'd set up this Punjab boundary force, which, to be fair, wasn't sufficient for the purposes. I think it became a bigger problem than they realised, and they were all of them were naive, not just Mountbatten. But I think he does take some responsibility, and I think he felt very guilty about it. And as a result, again, his finest hour was in the work in terms of dealing with the refugees afterwards. But I think, the British basically didn't want to spoil the show, so they kept quiet. He had been warned by a lot of people, particularly the governors of Bengal and Punjab, about what would happen, and he ignored them. But so did lots of other people on his staff, and also the Indian leaders who were also warned. So I think it's a collective responsibility rather than just Mountbatten. I mean, ironically, in the book, which is quite critical of Mountbatten's private life in some ways, in terms of his public life, I'm much more sympathetic to him than many of the other books, including the official biographies.
Still to come on the History Extra podcast.
In some ways, it was shocking to me because it didn't really fit the picture that I had. There'd been stories that he was bisexual, but most of these were second and third hand.
And at this time, Edwina is also instrumental in many cases kind of keeping order, and she's helping on a humanitarian level with refugee camps and healthcare and so on. What can you say about her activities?
Yes, I mean, she really comes into her own. She'd done this very much at the end of the war, when he remained in Southeast Asia, repatriating POWs and also Japanese troops. And she did marvellous work there. And she did the same thing absolutely in India, working quite closely with Nehru. I think that's what cemented that relationship, because he was doing quite a lot of that stuff himself. But she would, fearlessly go out to some places which were pretty dangerous. But she organised camps. She made sure nurses were there. She was a great morale booster. She would visit all sorts of people. And she had absolutely no prejudice against anything. So she would go to a leper colony and mix with people. I mean, shades of sort of Princess Diana. And they really were working as a team then, and she was very, very supportive of what he was doing as well. So I think that was, in some ways, their finest hour. I mean, he's criticised for what happened before independence, but actually, as a result of what happened, he really came into his own.
If we can go back to Nehru and Edwina's relationship then, because it really is a fascinating portion of your book.
Well, one of the problems is the correspondence between Dicky and Edwina is still closed. The correspondence between Edwina and Nehru is also closed. So all one can go on is what has been quoted in some of the previous official books where people had access. But I think what comes clear is that it was a very profound relationship, certainly for her. I think less so for him. I mean, he was having affairs with other people at the same time too. But she sort of found someone completely on the same wavelength with her. It was a rather romanticised view, but then they wrote to each other the whole time. She would be like a lovesick sort of teenager ringing up the switchboard to talk to the Indian Prime Minister. She would go out to India after the war for a few months at the beginning of the year, and he would always come to Britain in the autumn. So they saw quite a bit of each other. But it is a very moving story, and the sense that it's like a brief encounter in some ways, that they know that they can't really spend their lives together because of their responsibilities, but it's a very, very poignant and romantic relationship. And when she dies, he is allowed, and she's buried at sea, he's allowed to send a frigate and to send a wreath, which is thrown at the same time as Mountbatten's wreath is thrown. I think it's much more of a physical relationship than people imagine. They were both highly sexual people. I've got evidence from people whose uncles were press attachés and ambassadors who saw them sharing rooms together. So there's quite a lot of first-person testimony of the relationship, which the family, for some reason, have denied. They first of all said it was purely platonic, and then Nehru was impotent. So it couldn't have been consummated. But my own feeling, and I think other people share this, other biographers and even members of the family, Edwina's sister and people like that this was a proper full-scale affair, and probably the most important of her life, alongside the Bunny Phillips one.
You mentioned Edwina's death there in 1960. I wonder if we could skip ahead a bit, because it's all in the book, to Edwina's death and Mountbatten's reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean, it is an extraordinary thing, the death. She's on a tour for St John Ambulance in Borneo when she suddenly, literally goes to bed saying she's feeling a bit weak. She's due to fly to Singapore the next morning, and her secretary comes in and finds that she's just died of heart failure during the night. The letters of Nehru are spread around her bed. She's been reading them. Dicky is told by a phone call in the middle of the night. He, in fact, was waiting for her to call him and thought that call was just to give their daily chat. He's absolutely gobsmacked by this. I mean, he realizes how close they've become and how important she's been in his life. And, like a lot of people, you realize what you've got when you lose it. And an indication of, and I've seen the letters, 8,000 condolence letters were sent. Amazing response and services in Westminster Abbey and elsewhere. But he is absolutely thrown by it. He's also financially much worse off. There was 80% death duties. So off the remaining 20%, the daughters get 7.5% each, and he has 5%. So he's thinking that he actually sacked some of the staff. They'd always lived very extravagantly with lots and lots of staff. And he thinks of selling their house in Ireland, Classieborne. In fact, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. suggests that he should leave the Navy and he can help him with some property development in the Bahamas. So his life completely changes at this point. He's very resilient, and he picks up. He resumes his naval career. He ends up being chief of the defence staff in 1965. He then retires and gets very involved with various charities, particularly United World Colleges. And he then also begins a series of affairs himself. So Yola is still there in the background, living in France, but he has quite a profound relationship with Sasha Abercorn, the daughter of Gina Phillips. So again, very incestuous. His goddaughter, a woman who's 46 years younger than he is. So she's 18 when he's in his 60s. But he also has an affair with Shirley MacLaine, the actress, and with various other socialites, some of whom are still alive, and so I can't say who they are. I have to wait for a new edition. But he certainly has a range of affairs. He's very good with young people. He remains very, very active. I think he needed to drive himself, just like Edwina needed to drive herself in some ways to give direction to their life. And I think in some ways Edwina was trying to make up for lost time. She felt she'd wasted a lot of her 20s and 30s, and she almost had to make reparations for the way she'd behaved. And I think that's what drove her, because she was always being told, you're going to have a heart attack if you carry on. She was only 58 when she died, but she just had to keep going. She felt that there was, she had so much still to do.
Continuing a bit in the private sphere then, as you mentioned, your book looks at both the public impact of the Mountbattens and their private life. A chapter of your book, Rumours, addresses new documents you found that suggest revelations about Dicky. What can you say about that?
Yeah, this is in some ways the most controversial chapter in the book. It's only 3,000 or 4,000 words in a book of 120,000 words, and it is called Rumours. I lay out the evidence for people to draw their own conclusions. And in some ways, it was shocking to me because it didn't really fit the picture that I had. There'd been stories that he was bisexual, but most of these were second and third hand. I think what really changed things was partly I talked to a member of the royal family who confirmed that he was bisexual. But I also found through freedom of information requests with the FBI that they'd opened a file on him in 1944. A woman called Lady Desise, who was a society hostess and gossip columnist, had come to them and said, it's ridiculous that this man is a Supreme Allied Commander because he likes little boys. And he's not a man who should be given these sort of jobs. So the FBI kept this file, and they opened other files as other people came forward. So a man called John Grombach, who was an intelligence officer who ran a series of informants, also had stories like this. He also had a wonderful story about how Anthony Eden had an affair with Duff Cooper's wife, and the story had been taken to Churchill. And then there was another character who was married to the future Secretary of State for India, Lord Listowel, and she also had stories. Now, of course, this isn't conclusive. These are just stories that were given to the FBI, which they recorded. But 3 different people saying exactly the same thing for no reason, they didn't have any purpose to do it, does seem strange. I think what's also strange is that the FBI began to destroy the files after I started requesting them, suggesting that someone the British hadn't realised that there were files and asked that they would remove them. So I think there's that evidence. I also talked to quite a lot of people, or people began to emerge, talking. For example, a guards officer, quite a senior guards officer, told me about a young man that he had installed in a flat near to his flat in Kinderson Street. I interviewed a young guy now in his 70s, then his 20s, who'd been his lover for the last 7 years. But I also, in terms of the allegations of sexual abuse, I found 2 boys of 16 who'd been trafficked to him in Classieborne. Now, I found them, they had no reason to make things up. What they said to me was very persuasive because they knew things that no one could have known unless you'd been to Classieborne and knew some of the characters. They weren't paid. For legal reasons, we haven't been able to name them, but they both have cases with reputable lawyers. And it's quite clear that one of them was at Concora and one of them was trafficked from London. So I think it's pretty persuasive evidence. There are stories of him being caught with guardsmen in St James's Park. I think what I find so extraordinary is not just that he was doing this, but he was so open about it. People were talking about prostitutes being sent up to his room when he was at SHAPE headquarters, that he was so open about it, but everyone kept quiet. And one of the people I interviewed was his chauffeur or his driver from 1948, a man who is now in his 90s, who suddenly at the end of the interview, we talked about other things, said, I've kept a secret for the last 70 years, which I feel I need to now share. Everyone knew I would be discreet because I was in the Navy, but this is the story. I was asked to take him to show him where a male brothel was in Malta. So I think people are beginning to emerge and talk about things. Someone just popped up the other day after the book came out saying that as a naval attaché, his job was to try and find young men who he might seduce. And he was well known in the lifeguards, where he was the colonel-in-chief, that he interviewed all the young officers and he would put his hand on your knee and see what happened. So a completely different side. He lived a lie. And I think the interesting thing is how long the secret has taken to emerge.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if we could also talk about his death, because we're in the 40th year since his death. What can you say about the events of that and what that came to represent for the royal family and elsewhere?
It's exactly 40 years since he died. It's extraordinary that so many people are still alive. And one of the things I discovered, several interesting things, is that there have been plots against him going back to the 1960s. He'd had quite heavy security, and he continued to go because he loved going to Ireland. Classieborne was 12 miles south of the border. But I think one of the extraordinary things is in the summer of 1979, he was told not to go, advised by his police protection people here not to go. Erin Eve, of course, had just been killed a few months earlier. There'd been several kidnappings and other murders. They knew there were plots against him. So it was a little rash to go, particularly when he was there with his family. The other thing I found extraordinary was he had a military policeman who guarded him called Graham Ewell. Graham Ewell did an intelligence assessment showing that he was particularly vulnerable on his boat, which was moored in the harbour and wasn't protected at night. And there had been previous attempts on the boat. So that should have been something they dealt with. Instead of putting protection on, Graham Ewell was sacked. He was forced to sign a gagging order, which only expired 2 years ago. And the protection was given to the Garda, who were far less experienced and indeed infiltrated by the IRA. So that's one great mystery. Ewell had also pointed out that he'd seen a car with Belfast number plates, which he thought belonged to the IRA, and nothing seems to have been done about that. So I think it's probably cock-up, but poor old Mountbatten really wasn't given a chance. I think one of the ironies of his death is that actually it appalled people, particularly this his grandson and another boy in the boat, both teenagers were killed, that a lot of the support from North America stopped. It led to greater cooperation between the North and the South in terms of intelligence sharing. So it was a bit of a known goal for the IRA. I think the other irony I discovered is that Mountbatten actually was in favour of a united Ireland, and had offered himself as an intermediary in any sort of peace negotiations. So they may have been more effective in trying to keep him alive than in killing him. He was actually sort of on their side.
Given these new aspects, then, where do they sit in his legacy?
Well, I think his legacy, clearly it casts a different light on him as a person. I mean, there was clearly this other side to his life that no one knew about. He also had all sorts of kinky fetishes about women and riding boots and breeches and things as well. I don't think his legacy is changed. I think it's shown that what I tried to show is he did curate the legend, and maybe we need to stand back 40 years later and reassess things. So a lot of things he claimed he didn't do. He couldn't possibly have done because he didn't have the influence to do so. I think, for example, he didn't have the power in India to really do much with people. It was almost inevitable, the partition and the pace of the transfer. I think in Southeast Asia, he had very little influence on what was going to happen. The resources were concentrated on the Americans and on Europe, and he couldn't do much there. So I describe him as a front of house man. He was very good at sort of dressing up and looking the part and making things dignified. So I think in some ways he's not quite the great man that we think, or his official biographer said. But he was a man of great achievements and gifts and dedicated public service. I think that the person that emerges from the book, I think, is the real hero, is Edwina, because of her humanitarian work. And I don't know what your feeling is, having read the book, but she, I think, has come out from under his shadow and is now, I think, a great person in her own right.
That was Andrew Loney. The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves is available now, published by Blink. For more on royal history, head to our website, HistoryExtra.com. The Christmas issue of BBC History magazine is also out today, with features on the fall of Roman Britain, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and strange historical Christmas traditions. That's all for today. Thanks for listening. This podcast was produced by Ben Hewitt and Jack Bateman. We'll be back on Monday when I'll be speaking to Lara Makelem about hunting for historical treasures on the River Thames.